Good morning. This is Mr. Lamond, and we're doing AP US History, Unit 14. So we call this unit an era of protest and change. And so basically, history, we break it up into all these parts, and the way I've decided to do it in this class is, if you noticed in Unit 13, we did the whole Cold War. We started in 1945 after the war and went all the way to the end. And so we, talked about things that were happening in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s, but not everything, just Cold War. We're going to kind of do some things similar here in Unit 14. So the first thing we're actually going to cover is civil rights, 14.1. And we're going to do this kind of like we did the Cold War, in that we're going to cover all of the civil rights movement. We're going to start in the 1940s and go up through the 1970s, talk about civil rights. The other three questions that are going to go along with Unit 14 deal with decades. So we're going to talk about the 1950s, the 1960s, and the 1970s. And the 60s and 70s are really America's, outside of maybe the Civil War, our most divided time, our era of protest and change. Lots of division, lots of protest, lots of anti-blank movements. So that's how we're going to break this unit down. We're going to do now 14.1 was the struggle for civil rights for Black Americans finally won in the 1950s. And we could debate that. And then also we're going to talk about why then. Why in the 50s was it such an important time? Or wasn't it? We're going to break this into two parts. It gets pretty lengthy. So let's start off with the beginning of the civil rights movement. Of course, this image here, a little different image than where you're used to seeing this gal. You might recognize her. If you don't recognize her face, you definitely would know her name. That's Rosa Parks being fingerprinted for her infamous ride on the bus. And we'll get to that here shortly. Okay, here we go. So let's talk a little bit about the civil rights movement, kind of where they started. And so early on, there were some demands for equality for African Americans. And what that had led to was two Latin phrases in terms of how America dealt with segregation. One was de jure, J-U-R-E, by law, segregation. Things like Plessy versus Ferguson, the Supreme Court case in 1896 that had made separate but equal the law of the land. You could see some images of Jim Crow, drinking fountains, colored theaters, or colored people movie theaters, etc. But you could also refer to some of the segregation as what they would call de facto, meaning by precedent. It wasn't the law, it's just kind of how we do things around here, boy. There were certain towns where it was known that black folks should be out by sundown. That's just kind of how it was. You didn't whistle at a white girl across the street. There wasn't a law against that. But there were laws against interracial marriage. There was laws against, of course, schools that were segregated. And if you use this map here, you get a sense for kind of how America was divided. You've got de jure segregation, all the red, your deep south, your solid south. And then some of your western states and farthest northeast, there's no legislation at all. Basically saying, yeah, we're not going to say segregation exists. Blue was, okay, well, it's up to you guys. And green, your heavily northern states, it was forbidden. There can be no segregation. So again, America's divided. Look how much this looks like a Civil War map, minus the colors. And so into that, we talked in the last unit about maybe one of the first moments of desegregation was when the President of the United States, 1948, basically said that the troops need to be desegregated. Well, that's 1/3 of our three branches that has basically said segregation doesn't work. We don't need it anymore. We proved in World War II that blacks are equal to whites in combat. And heck, if Jackie Robinson's the best player in the league, well, it's good enough for us. And so the executive branch has made a statement, late 40s, that segregation should not continue. Perhaps the biggest step, though, was a different branch, the SCOTUS. And this is the radical Supreme Court case for its time, Brown versus Topeka Board of Education, 1954. Now, kind of a silly way to remember that, but brown people wanted to go to school with white people in desegregated schools. So Brown versus Topeka Board of Education. You can see a picture in the top left here, and the most famous member of this trio is this guy in the middle. That's Thurgood Marshall, who was one of the main lawyers in the Supreme Court case and will end up being the first black American to be on the Supreme Court. Regardless, there's a group of families who all basically took different states to court. And here's a group of kids in Kansas. And they said, listen, we want to go to school in a separate, in an equal facility. And basically what they're saying is Plessy versus Ferguson has created an inherent system where separate is unequal. You would go to white schools where they would have nice new desks and shiny light bulbs and brand new books. And then you'd go to the colored school and you would find, mold in the ceiling and old tattered books, and it was unequal. And so they argued it before the Supreme Court. And in the Supreme Court case, the SCOTUS, again, now branch number 2, says segregation no longer accepted. Okay? And so if you remember, Webb Du Bois had started a group called the NAACP, National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. And that group was largely responsible for pushing this case into the Supreme Court. Now, remember our earlier unit, progressivism? We talked about the different arguments between Webb Du Bois and his counterpart, Booker T. Washington. Remember, Washington had said, hey, if we focus on education and economic, equality, then we'll slowly gain presence and power. We're going to see that played out here shortly. But Webb Du Bois had pushed for more political change, faster social change. Well, here's an example of Webb Du Bois' strategy playing out. By pushing this case into the courts, the national courts, they got the most important branch of the government to say, we need to overturn Plessy versus Ferguson. So we've got a few of these enrichment videos that you could pause and go check out. This one is on history.com. You could go separate but not equal, or Brown versus Board of Education. So you could pause and go watch that, and then we'll pick up when you come back. Okay, so now that the Supreme Court has said that all schools need to be desegregated, well, that doesn't mean that they're gonna be desegregated. Okay, remember when Andrew Jackson, Supreme Court told Andrew Jackson in Worcester versus Georgia that the Indians could stay and that they need to keep their territory? And the President of the United States basically said, well, I don't care. And he sent in the troops and shipped them out. So, just because the Supreme Court says something doesn't mean it's going to happen. Here's one way for you to think about this. Somebody once referred to the Supreme Court as the thermostat, as the thermometer, not the thermostat. Okay, so a thermostat controls temperature in your house. You set it to 68, it'll turn on the air conditioner and make it 68 degrees. So the thermometer just records the temperature. So what they mean is that the Supreme Court, because it has no army, remember Andrew Jackson, John Marshall, where's your army to enforce your decision? Since it has no power to enforce laws, it's more like a thermometer that just records the temperature. Well, that's still rather important, because if the Supreme Court's reading of the temperature has said that America is ready for desegregation, well, then maybe it's ready for desegregation. Well, Governor Faubus, the governor of Arkansas, basically said, I'm not going to obey the Supreme Court at all. The Supreme Court's not going to tell me what to do. And so when some students tried to go to Little Rock High School, or Little Rock Central High School in Arkansas, he took the state guard and put them around the doors and wouldn't let them in. There was another governor down in Alabama, Governor George Wallace, was famous for saying, segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. It's basically a way of saying, I'm another Southern governor, and we're not going to have any desegregated schools in my state. Well, at this point, Eisenhower needs to make a decision. Is he going to let state governments dictate policy, or is the federal government going to support the Supreme Court of the United States? Well, Governor Eisenhower, remember why he's famous? D-Day, okay, Ike, defeating Hitler. He's not used to getting pushed around by folks. And so he sends in the 101st Airborne. These are guys who paratrooped into Normandy and defeated, the Germans and Hitler. They're not going to get pushed around by a couple of rednecks with a chair. And so the 101st Airborne escorted these kids to class every day. He took the State Guard and made it the National Guard. And so these students were basically escorted to class by military with M16s. At first, they actually went in the school with them. And then the teachers and the principal kind of said, it's a little distracting when our kids have M16s next to them while they're taking a quiz. So the troops stopped going in. They just got them inside and took them home. Well, that meant that things got a little rough for the Little Rock Nine inside the school. And they were spat on, cursed, bullied, pushed on, but they couldn't fight back. And here's one of the things that you realize very quickly about the civil rights movement. And you're going to see this idea grow, especially under the leadership of the NAACP and Martin Luther King. If you create problems by fighting back, people are going to make an argument that it's not working, regardless of whether it's the right thing to do or not. And so these students basically had to take the abuse. You can see this super famous picture here, this gal screaming at Elizabeth. I can't remember her last name, but Elizabeth just yelling and screaming at her on her way into school. You don't even want to think about the kind of things she's saying. It's kind of an interesting moment. If you want, you can, again, take a time out, get an enrichment at the Little Rock Nine, very powerful group of students. But these two people from the picture actually met many years later, 2015, and they had a reconciliation moment. It didn't last, but it was an interesting kind of way to show that over time you could maybe heal. Okay, so let's talk now about our very famous image here. Of course, we know who this gal is. That's Rosa Parks. Now, what is odd about this picture? And here's this sweet grandmotherly lady getting her mugshot taken because she was riding a bus and sitting in the front seat. And people would look at this picture. This picture would be in the paper up in the north, Minnesota, New Jersey, Wisconsin. And so, here's some guy sitting down to have dinner, and he's looking at the paper, or he's having his morning coffee, he's looking at the paper. He sees this lady holding this card for a mugshot, and he's like, oh, man, that looks like some lady was making cookies and lemonade for the kids. What'd she get arrested for? Would she murder somebody, or was she rob a bank? And you read the story, no, she sat in the front seat of the bus. Right. This sweet lady got arrested because she sat in the front seat of a bus. That's stupid. And what begins to happen is people in the North, kind of like they're awakened to the abolition movement because of people like Frederick Douglass, William Lloyd Garrison, the Grimke sisters. People in the North start to get awakened to the civil rights movement because of images like these. This civil disobedience. Remember that concept, Henry David Thoreau, where you intentionally break a law and intentionally take the punishment. Well, here's what happens. The people of Montgomery said, okay, if you're not going to let us ride on the front of the bus, we won't ride the bus anymore. And they organized, keyword organized, a boycott. Basically said, we won't ride the buses. And so they hitchhiked, they walked, these folks walking in the, these folks walking in the rain here, hitchhiking, and they said, listen, we're talking about miles, walking miles, hitchhiking in the summer, Alabama. Okay, this is not comfortable. They organized carpools, station wagons, and they, for over a year, stopped riding the buses. Well, look, what's the result of that? You got empty buses. Now here's where color really comes into play, but not brown or white. Now the color here is green. Because if I'm a bus owner in Montgomery, I might have cared about segregated buses, and I might have been, you know, against those, brown people trying to ride in the front of the bus, etc. But after a while of having empty buses, I stopped caring about brown and I start caring about green, which I don't have any of. So I ain't even making any money. And so what happens is these boycotts slowly start to work because of the economic power of Black Americans. Whoa, is that Booker T. Washington in the bottom left of this slide? Is that Booker T going, I told you, make money and they'll pay attention. And so slowly but surely, the bus company said, all right, if the blacks aren't going to ride and our wallets are going to be empty, then we're going to let them ride. Okay? And so this nonviolent protest, where you don't fight back, because if you fight back, then the whites have an excuse to fight you back. We're going to do that. And so this is on the news every night. People are sitting down to eat their TV dinner and watch the evening news, and they're just watching these poor folks hitchhiking, and they're going, man, the South better get their act together, man. Those guys, they're losing their minds. And so with that being said, we finally have a piece of legislation, the Civil Rights Act of 1957. The federal government, the third branch, the legislative branch, gets involved. It's a weak start, but it's a start. Here's an enrichment that you can look at to help you realize how organized people were with the Montgomery bus boycott, and also kind of an insight as to Rosa Parks not being the first. Okay, another example of civil disobedience. Now in Greensboro, North Carolina. Now it's at this point that Martin Luther King Jr. has become the most famous civil rights leader. Remember, you saw his picture here leading part of this protest. And basically what happens is he's this young pastor who gets it, totally gets these things: civil disobedience, northern sympathy equals legislative change. We've got to break the laws peacefully, nonviolent protest. We've got to get people in the North, the voting bloc in the North, to start to join our side, because we're not going to convince thousands of Southerners to get rid of de jure and de facto legislation. We need to convince thousands of Northerners to get rid of it. And so as he takes over leadership, their boycott, protest strategy expands. And in 1960, you've got a group of students from North Carolina A&T. Remember the Morrill Land Grant Act started North Carolina Agricultural and Technical School. So they went into a Woolworths. Woolworths is kind of like a Walmart or Kmart. You guys don't know what Kmart is. So they went into this lunch counter and they sat at the white-only lunch counter. Well, the guy said, we ain't serving you here. This is for whites only. I said, okay, well, don't serve us. We're still going to sit here. And then a few hours later, they went home. And they came back the next day. A few more of their friends sat at the lunch counter. We ain't going to serve you. Okay, we're just going to sit here. Well, then it starts to spread, and next thing you know, you got a bunch of idiots. You can just see idiot 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, all the idiots here. And what are they there to do? Well, they're there to bully, to demean, to humiliate the protesters. I don't know if you can see, but this guy, I don't know if that's a chocolate shake or ketchup, pouring drinks on their head, looks like a milkshake on her head. So what are they doing? They're attacking the protesters, but they can't attack them violently because there's too many people around. But they're just humiliating them. And notice what the protesters are doing: nonviolent civil disobedience. Now, there's something else that you should recognize here. Look close at the picture, and what's kind of interesting. See a white face? See a brown face. We've got whites and browns protesting the civil rights movement together. Now, it was started by 4 Black American students. But once whites begin to join in, now we're going to have all these people on the periphery, all these white folks, whether in the South or in the North, who at first were kind of like, oh man, what are those, colored people arguing about? And they look at pictures of, guys protesting. But then the next go around, they see pictures of white people in the protest, and they're going, wait a minute. Why are white people helping the brown people? And then they've got to stop and ask themselves, maybe this isn't a problem for just Black Americans. Maybe this is a problem for all Americans. Maybe we're wrong as Americans. It's kind of like the abolition movement again. And so these sit-ins, these boycotts, began to lead to more and more nonviolent resistance. And a lot of them were college kids. There was something they started called the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Well, just think about that. Student. These are college kids. A lot of them are, working from the grassroots up, trying to create equality. If you remember the American Revolution, we had the committees of correspondence, that kind of grassroots movement. Well, now here's a different version of that, helping the civil rights movement to make gains. 1961, we had a group of people called the Freedom Riders. So interstate busing, they're still dealing with segregation. And so a bunch of freedom riders, whites and blacks, got on buses and started riding through the South as a way of basically saying, look, we're all going to ride on the bus, whites and blacks, any seat, no problems. Well, that didn't work out so well, because as they pulled into these southern cities, they were met with lots of violence. You can see here this one bus, it is on flames. This is one of the freedom riders who was dragged off a bus and beaten about to death. These mobs would meet these freedom buses, these freedom riders, and it was incredibly dangerous. You see, John F. Kennedy finally sent the National Guard to get them home so they didn't get killed. And so this violence is shocking America. Again, you're not going to change the mind of some racist in Alabama, but some, factory worker in Montana, well, probably not a lot of factories in Montana, some farmer in Montana or some factory worker in Detroit looks at these pictures like, why is the bus on fire? Oh, some white people lit it on fire because black people were riding on it. Wait, what? What happened to this guy? Why did he get beat up? Was he did he rob a bank or something? No, he was riding on a bus with some black people. Wait, what? And again, the rest of the country is looking at the South. It's kind of like your crazy uncle that you just want to go away. And they're slowly starting to realize that we need more change. Just like the Little Rock Nine integrated a high school, James Meredith was able to integrate Ole Miss University. It is just amazing to me that this is still the mascot of Ole Miss, the Rebels. Still holding on to, let's face it, it's a racist mascot. That's a slave plantation owner. The Rebels rebelled against our country. And so here's James Meredith, escorted by troops, having to go through a gauntlet of bullies and, harsh moments. He was actually shot, not killed, later on. But he was able to help integrate a federal university. Okay. The culmination of Martin Luther King's strategy was proved in Birmingham, Alabama. Basically, Martin Luther King said, what's the most racist city in America? And everybody said, oh, that's easy. Birmingham, Alabama, Steel City. So he said, okay, we're going to Birmingham. If we can break Birmingham's grip on segregation, then we can create lasting change. And so they went in, civil disobedience, nonviolent protest, met with attack dogs. Look at this well-dressed, mannerly young man. Look at this guy. He's in his Sunday hat, a tie, nice pants, and they're being attacked by dogs. And again, folks around the country are like, why is the dog attacking them? Because they're doing a protest march. You've got the Birmingham Fire Department. That means they're sponsored by the government. Their sheriff, Bull Connor, who was the biggest loudmouth, racist, ignorant fool, would just get on the loudspeaker and say the dumbest things and order the fire department to blast these protesters with fire hoses. You would see little images of small children being blown across the sidewalk by these fire hoses. I mean, those things, they hurt. Okay? And so there was this nonviolent protest is met with a radical amount of violence. And America's watching on TV, and just shaking their head going, what is wrong with those people in the South? Well, then Martin Luther King gets arrested for breaking some I don't remember exactly what it was, but he went in the wrong place or did the wrong thing. Next thing you know, he's in jail. Well, his wife, Coretta Scott King, was absolutely petrified that he was going to get killed in prison, and a lot of people were. And basically, after a long process, John F. Kennedy, with his brother Robert F. Kennedy, stepped in and basically called the prison, called the governor, and said, look, you need to take care of this guy, because if you don't take care of Martin Luther King, we're going to come down there and take your state over. We're going to make things work in a way that you don't want us to work. And this is one of the reasons, remember, we haven't really gone over this yet, but John F. Kennedy is a Catholic. Okay, he's going to be our first Catholic president. And you've got a lot of Black Baptist pastors who are going to be voting for John F. Kennedy. And this is one of the reasons why, because he stepped in to help protect Martin Luther King. Now, the apex moment for the civil rights movement was Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech. Maybe, if the Gettysburg Address is not America's best and most famous speech, then this is. On the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, that was not a coincidence. And so here, thousands and thousands of people, white and black. Again, it's very important to realize that the leadership here was black. The movement was coordinated by the NAACP. But in order for all of America to be convinced that the civil rights movement is moving the right way, you need at least some of these people to be of other colors, white, yellow, red, etc. Well, Martin Luther King gets up there, and he wasn't even the main speaker. He just one of the last guys to get up there, and he delivers, kind of like Gettysburg Address, Abraham Lincoln. He delivers this relatively short address where he talks about, I have a dream that one day little black girls and little black boys and little white boys and little white girls will play in the sandbox together. And it was the best speech. But even more is people were petrified that this huge protest, look at all these people, was going to turn violent. Well, that's not Martin Luther King's style, and there was no violence. And again, it just resonated across America that this is a movement that we all need to get behind. We need to support Martin Luther King. Okay, so we're going to go and pause here, and we'll pick up with another part 2 here shortly.